All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming here today to be part of what for ASPI is a fantastic occasion, and that is the opening of the first office of an Australian think tank here in Washington DC. As you'll see looking around, the office is still a work in progress. The decor is at best Swedish minimalist, but if you'd been here the week before last, this would have been an empty space. If you'd come at the beginning of last week, it would have been stacked floor to ceiling with boxes. So personally, I'm delighted that we got it to this point so that we get to have this occasion, this event here today. I'm particularly delighted to be able to welcome friends and colleagues from the leading US think tanks and academic institutions here in Washington, DC. Thank you for coming today. I'm also pleased to be able to welcome a number of senior Australian officials, both resident here in Washington and visiting from Australia. The Ambassador, the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos, had to send late apologies, but send his best wishes for the event. I do want to recognise Ambassador Sinodinos' predecessor, a former ambassador to the United States in Joe Hockey, and my former boss at the embassy a few years back. I would also like to recognise the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, General Angus Campbell, the Secretary of the Australian Department of Defence, Greg Moriarty. We also have present with us, and I think I can say this is a first for any think tank, the heads of four of Australia's most important and largest national intelligence agencies. So if I could welcome the Directors General from the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, the Australian Signals Directorate, and the Office of National Intelligence. Thank you so much for coming. I know you have to leave at some point during the proceedings, but I did just want to acknowledge the effort you've made to be with us today, so thank you very much. And of course, we are doubly honoured because we're very fortunate to be able to have both the Minister for Defence and the Deputy Prime Minister here to help us open the office here today, of course in the person of the Hon Richard Marles MP. And I know your program is jam-packed, and to be able to find time to come and share this occasion with us, we are truly appreciative of it. Thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to introduce Justin Bassi, the Executive Director from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra, and invite Justin to say a few opening remarks. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for being here. Deputy Prime Minister, Ambassador, former Ambassador, CDF, Secretary, Intel Agency Chiefs, ASPI Fellows and friends. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today as the Australian Strategic Policy Institute opens an office in Washington, DC. It will fulfil the vision of my predecessor, Peter Jennings, and the ASPI Council, chaired by Ken Gillespie. With us today is Fergus Hanson, one of ASPI's directors and one of the first people to pitch the idea of such an office. Also here is a founding DC member, Chloe Habelry. Significant thanks does need to go to Secretary Greg Moriarty and his team, and former Minister Dutton for recognising the benefits to Australia in allocating some seed funding to establish this DC office. For anyone who has worked in government, think tanks, national security or international relations, there is always a special energy about coming to Washington. A sense of being in close proximity to decision-making and policy-making that shapes the world in which we live. DC is the most important and influential ideas marketplace in the world. And as one of the most important US allies, it's important Australia is competing in this marketplace and providing US decision makers and the US public with a perspective from the most critical part of the world. ASPI already has a reputation for quality in the US. And the ASPI office will have a unique role here, providing an Australian voice and ensuring Australian perspective is injected into public commentary, policy development, and decision making. That's why Mark Watson was selected as our inaugural director in DC, an Australian with decades of experience in national security and right here in Washington, DC. It is of particular special pride that we have the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles to formally open the office. The DPM is the first Minister of the new Australian Government to visit the US and we are really honoured that you are here today during what is an important and busy trip for you and for Australia-US relations, including through the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue happening this week. Richard has had a long association with ASPI, both as a Shadow Defence Minister and now as Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister. Richard, in 2017, you said at ASPI in Canberra, any assessment of the state of our region since 1941 begins with an assessment of our successful alliance with the United States of America. You also said that being at ASPI forces you to test your thinking against some of the most experienced minds in the world. So it would only make sense now that ASPI is opening a branch in Washington, DC, placing itself among the minds of the world's most strategic and influential thinkers. Australia and the US have demonstrated consistently over a century that we are strongest and have the most positive impact on the world when we are working together. ASPI's DC office will further boost this deep relationship and enable a two-way policy dialogue on how we face our current and emerging challenges and shape our future. With that, I look forward to you, Deputy Prime Minister, formally opening the office and to the team here influencing security, defence and foreign policy thinking in DC and around the world. Deputy PM, it is with great pleasure that I ask you to say a few words and open ASPI DC.
Well, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Mark. It's a tremendous honour, really, to be here to open this office. Swedish minimalist is a way to describe it. As I looked at the exposed ceiling, I was kind of thinking Pompidou Centre in terms of the genre that you were going for. But it was pointed out to me that this really this is not a faux opening. This is literally the first day in the office. So it's great to be here. And the fact that the significance of this moment, I think, is given expression by who's in the audience. I'm obviously here with the CDF and the Secretary, and it's great to have you both here. Joe, it's really wonderful to see you here as well. I didn't know that the four agency heads were allowed to sit next to each other in a row. That is a little scary as I look at the four of them. There'll be a moment during the proceedings where we'll all be looking a different direction, and they'll just vanish. But it is great that you're here, and again, it says something about how important this moment is. ASPI is now in its third decade, and is a leading think tank in Australia. Has been an enormous resource for me as I've come to, not really having a background in defence and strategic policy, but as it is always the case with us in politics, needing to get on a horse pretty quickly. ASPI was fundamentally important to me in giving me the education I needed around strategic policy, around defence. And in so many ways, the product of ASPI is critically important, not only in informing the Australian public, but those of us in government who seek to play a role in this space. And that's as it's been since 2001. And when you look at what it was imagined when it was first set up to who now supports ASPI financially and who uses its product, ASPI has grown and has blossomed. And we are really lucky to have ASPI in the firmament, really, of think tanks in Australia. And I think, Justin, you are going to add the next chapter to ASPI, and I really wish you the best of luck in the role that you're performing. Washington is many things. It's a centre of power. It's a centre of government. There are many people in this town who really are the custodians of American history, but it is a centre of thought. Square inch by square inch, there are more think tanks in this place than anywhere else in the world. And so it makes complete sense that ASPI would open its first office overseas right here. To take the advantage of that, to be in the stream of that thought, to feed that back into Australia's thinking around strategic policy. But as Justin said, it's a reciprocal process. It's not just about sucking in that information, it's about inserting into the stream of thought here how we see the world and the challenges that Australia faces, and giving an Australian flavour to the nature of the discussion, which is so important, that takes place in this town. And so this is a really significant moment to be opening an office. And Mark, I think you should feel really excited about the opportunity you've got, and I know that the office will be under really safe stewardship in your hands. But it is a really significant thing. I do want to, Peter's not here, I thought Peter was going to be here, but I do want to acknowledge Peter Dutton, my friend and my predecessor as Minister for Defence. He made the decision, and it's often the case in the way our government works that immediately after an election you end up being the beneficiary of the one who's cutting the ribbon of the work that was done before you. I've been through that process on the other side. It could be a little frustrating. So let me acknowledge the decision that Peter made. It's to his credit that this day is happening, and he is worthy of praise in this moment. So with those words, it is my enormous pleasure on this day to be announcing the opening of ASPI's Washington office. I am up for a ribbon cut.
We thought we'd actually mark the occasion with the red, white and blue. And Minister, if you would do the honours, please.
There you go. Okay. We're good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Really
Well
good.
done.
Well, thank you for doing that, that was some ribbon cutting. That was. I think with the number of think tankers here, they might like a quick opportunity to ask you a couple of questions, if that's okay. But before I open it up for anyone who does, might selfishly take the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
We are increasingly in a global contest for ideas, values, standards, and rules. We're in an era of information and disinformation, with more available to not just governments, but the public than ever before. Given we're here at ASPI, a bit of a self-serving question, but also here with several experts from some of DC's great think tanks, what do you see as the role of think tanks, in particular here in DC, in both informing government policy and in increasing public awareness?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think and you put it well in terms of the competing pressures here. I think if you see it solely through the lens of democratic countries, in a world of social media, of kind of information overload, but the loss of an objective truth, the need to have quality, authoritative, reliable information and thought is profoundly important. Like it actually, it's profoundly important in terms of the way in which democracies evolve. Jefferson spoke about when in those early days of the American democracy that the informed citizenry was a critical component to the functioning of democracies. That the way in which we think about an informed citizenry now, in the era of social media and fake news, it's brought into question. And so I actually think it sharpens the need for a think tank, or for think tanks, but a think tank like ASPI, to provide that original thought, but that authoritative thought, which can inform the way in which commentary and ultimately information is distributed to that citizenry. But then, if you go a bit beyond that, I think, and maybe it's related, there is something of a contest globally. There are authoritarian countries which are challenge the democratic model, challenge its the age of it, I guess, the effectiveness of it. And I think for those of us who believe in democracies, it's really important that the value of modern democracies is advocated. And again, I think that, that ultimately, it's kind of it's our way of life. It goes to the values that underpin us. But we take for granted in many ways the system which underpins the lives that we are living, that we wouldn't want to exchange for anyone else. But actually, those values and that system needs advocacy on the global stage right now. And so I think that in that sense, think tanks and ASPI have a really important role to play.
Excellent. That challenge to our values and the advocacy that we need, there's been a lot discussed in relation to the Pacific and how we can better ensure that we are well placed to remain the partner of choice. One of those ways that the government's priority is on climate change and climate policy, and that'll help with our friends and family in the region. But on Monday, you talked about the need for Australia and the US to contribute to a more effective balance of military power in the Indo-Pacific to avoid what you referred to as a catastrophic failure of deterrence. Could you elaborate on what that military collaboration would look like, and how can we create and sustain such deterrence?
Well, let me start by saying what the catastrophic failure of deterrence looks like, and it looks like Ukraine, or what's happening in Ukraine. That's what happens when there is a power which has engaged in a military build-up where they think it's worth the risk of utilising that power. And we are seeing a catastrophe unfold in Ukraine. So I think it's really important that we are doing everything we can to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Now that rolls off the tongue pretty easily, but it's actually a pretty big challenge when we are witnessing the single biggest military build-up of anywhere at any time since the end of the Second World War in the form of China. And that's happening in our backyard. So how do you maintain a balance of power in respect of that? And that is a really challenging question. I don't have all the answers to it, but one of the things that's clear to me is that the system, from the American point of view, the system of alliances that they have is really central to rightly what they would judge as being a competitive advantage. From our point of view, the alliance with the United States has never been really more important, and that's a big thing to say because it has been very important over its life, but it's probably been never more important than it is right now in terms of providing us with security and remains very much the cornerstone of the way we see the world. We have seen enormous progress over the last few decades in terms of the degree of interoperability between our defence forces, the extent to which we see Australians embedded in the American system and vice versa. We need to be building that level of seamless interaction within our industrial bases as well. And I think that's been a big theme of the conversations we've been having this week. There's, again, rolls off the tongue pretty easily, there's a lot of detail on that, but it is really important that we are operationalising the alliance at a defence industry level, at a kind of military level, defence to defence level, and I think that is actually in the face of what we are seeing now, what true partnership looks like, and what we must do if we are going to create that balance of power which provides for stability and safety in our region.
Excellent. And partnership is a lot of what ASPI DC is looking to do here, and work with a lot of the people who are in the room. And if you don't mind, might see if there are a couple of people who might have a question for you, Deputy Prime Minister. Does anyone have a question? Please raise your hand.
Excuse me. My name is Jim Christop. I'm with the Hudson Institute. You were speaking about a balance of power, Australia's defence policy. How is it oriented now with respect to developments in the South Pacific, particularly the United States?
So there's there is a narrow answer to that question to think about defence policy in respect of the Pacific. I'd prefer to, and it is a component of what I think is a broader answer that I would like to give about the overall posture of Australia to the Pacific. Firstly, what we're seeing in terms of the strategic competition from China in the Pacific is now at a different level to what we've seen before. The security agreement that was reached between China and Solomon Islands, it doesn't make inevitable a Chinese base in the Pacific, and we do very much welcome what both China and Solomons have said in giving an assurance that there won't be a Chinese base in the Pacific. But it is certainly a step down a road that we've not seen before. We aspire to be the natural partner of choice for the countries of the Pacific. And in doing that, we aspire to be that in cooperation with the United States, but not just the US, with countries like Japan, like New Zealand, like France, which is really important in the Pacific. But I use the word aspire because it's not something we get by right. You know, it's not, we don't get some magical kind of right to have exclusive friendship with the countries of the Pacific just by turning up. We actually have to earn this, and we have to do the work, and we need to focus on them. And the focusing on them is about, I think, focusing on their development challenges. To me, the call to arms actually in the Pacific is that this is one of the least developed parts of the world, on track to being the least developed part of the world by the end of this decade, unless we change the development trajectory. And focusing on that makes clear to the countries of the Pacific that we are focused on them. That even if other countries never existed, we would still be there to focus on them. And there is a defence angle to that, to be sure, but it's a much broader conversation than just that. It really is trying to lift the standard of living and the prosperity of the countries of the Pacific. Now, I actually think that, to that end, I might say the announcement that has been made by the American government in the last 48 hours of the Pacific Island Forum is fantastic. I mean, it really speaks to a different level of engagement from the US in the Pacific, and we really welcome that. But I really do think that it's within our collective power to change that trajectory of development in the Pacific. We should do that, and in doing that and working with the Pacific and focusing on them, we will be the natural partner of choice. That is actually the road to getting to that place, and so that in a broader sense is our focus on the Pacific.
Just going to make Steve feel really tall. Just a brief comment on ASPI. Eric Sayers with the American Enterprise Institute. I've been following ASPI since I was a research assistant 15 years ago. And back then it was sort of a place you could go to find conversations on defense debate in Australia. But I think this is happening at the exact right time, opening this office here, because in the last 5 or 6 years, from Washington's perspective, we've observed ASPI become more of a global think tank that's commenting on what's happening in Xinjiang, interference in different countries, the technology debate, in Huawei. And so I couldn't be more happy to kind of see this happening now and joining the debate here in Washington. Question for you, we're still processing this tragedy from last week with Prime Minister Abe. And, we're here to talk about Washington and Canberra's relationship, but could you speak a little bit to, the new government's perspective on Tokyo, and then now a post-Abe era, which, he's been important, obviously, as this Churchill of kind of, peacetime competition the last decade, setting up this trajectory. But with him gone, it's going to really matter, within the LDP faction that he led, where Tokyo goes from here. So could you speak a bit to your relationship with Tokyo?
Yeah, really good question. I completely agree with the comments that you made about ASPI, and I think what we are experiencing in Australia has a particular Australian dimension, but it's a function of something broader and bigger, and there are other countries which are experiencing similar things, and so I think it is right that ASPI elevates and lifts its eyes to be thinking on that global level, and you're right, they've been doing that, which is fantastic, and that's why this office is so important. What happened in Japan with the assassination of Shinzo Abe is, I think, a tragedy on a global scale. It is shocking. I mean, I feel trite in saying it. I don't know how to give a better expression to it than that. I was in Japan, I feel like 3 weeks ago. It wasn't long. It was actually the first bilateral visit that I did in this role, and that says something, first of all, about the priority that we see is our relationship with Japan. The centrepiece of that visit was actually a meeting with Defence Minister Kishi, who is Shinzo Abe's brother. And though Abe had, retired in a sense from the prime ministership, it was completely clear he was the giant of Japanese politics, and it led the LDP to the position of dominance that it has now within the Japanese system. But you're also right that his faction within the LDP is it's the engine room of Japanese politics. I don't know what it means with him not there. I certainly, he will, the legacy of what he did with Japan's role in the Quad and Japan's place in the TPP, will obviously live on and speak to an outward-looking Japan that is keenly interested in the regional architecture, both security and economic. I hope that obviously all of that continues. I mean, the people that we're dealing with are people who would see themselves in the tradition of Abe. So we would imagine all of that does continue. Your question really is about us, though, in terms of the way, our relationship with Japan. With all the challenges that we face, with the complex strategic circumstances that we have, driven really by the fact that our largest trading partner is also our biggest security anxiety. That, of course, is the same dilemma, if I use that word, that is experienced by Japan, kind of times 10, but both on an economic level and in terms of the way in which they feel the security anxiety. Plus, they've got territorial, disputes. It's how we navigate that and how we collectively navigate that, I don't think is obvious at all. What I do know is that this is a moment to be comparing notes with friends, and this is a moment to be very close to friends. And so I don't think there's ever been a point where our relationship with Japan has been more important. And so we see it as essentially as that. And one step further, I think in many ways trying to get the right word, but I think the potency of that relationship actually gets expression in the trilateral relationship between Japan, the United States and Australia. And we're thinking a lot about how we can operationalise that.
Very good question, very good answer. And Eric, thank you for your compliments about ASPI. You're welcome back anytime. Please.
Hi, I'm Ali Slinsky with the National Bureau of Asian Research, NBR. You mentioned that now is the time to be comparing notes with friends and like-minded countries. And of course, your notes on Japan, the Quad are our closest and natural partners to be having these conversations with. But I'm curious to also get your thoughts on a country that is seeing a potential shift, a potential opening to join more of these conversations, which is Korea. With a new administration coming in, showing some interest in joining these conversations where they weren't previously, in Quad Plus kind of mechanisms, or just playing a bigger regional role, kind of being more present in some of those regional structures. I want to get Australia's perspective on how we can work to bring Korea further into some of those configurations.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good question, and I've wondered that too, in the sense that, Korea is an alliance partner of the United States, so there's an immediate affinity right there in terms of the way, we see the world. Obviously, we've got a history, like a military history in Korea, which is, and a continuing participation in Korea in terms of our defence force. Korea is in our top 5 trading partners. So we have a really big economic relationship with Korea. Korea's strategic circumstances have a lot in common with us in terms of that's we're pursuing there. But I guess I suppose the high level answer to your question is, as we try and push against every door here to advance this agenda, I've been really encouraged by the reception amongst everyone we've spoken to. I reckon in this town people get it, and they know it needs to happen. I don't think anyone's underestimating the task, and so I actually feel really hopeful we'll get there.
I think we've got time for one more question. Please. G'day, Peter.
Thank you for your time and remarks and for opening up this office. It's great to have you here in DC on a more permanent footing. My question for you is, since think tanks and also the intelligence business is about questions and looking ahead, what are say the three big questions that are in your mind every day as you look out? Those of us that are out in the think tank world, those of us who are sort of moving in and out of government, sort of thinking about those things. We think we know what's on the mind of decision makers such as yourself, but it feels like we should take the opportunity to ask, like, what are those things that animate you as you're looking out at the world, looking out ahead for what this thing is doing,
Right.
that you'd like people to be thinking about and writing to as they're packaging things?
So there are three questions. I think there are a lot of questions. Is the answer? I think what I would say is we in opposition we would use language, which I continue to use, that we face the most complex set of strategic circumstances that we have as a nation since the end of the Second World War. That's a phrase which comes out pretty easily. I thought a lot about it in opposition and sought to unpack it, test that idea. I mean, there's been some pretty complex moments, fraught moments in the last 70 years, a Cold War, existential threat globally. We fought in Vietnam in that period of time. So really, are we talking at that level? And I kind of thought we probably are. But the nature of defence is that, and defence policy, and there's no critique in this, it's necessary, a lot of it happens behind a veil. A lot of it is kind of classified national secret. And so, on the other side of that veil, you get glimpses of it. It's not quite an impressionist painting, it's more, some dots on a canvas that's largely blank, which do give you a sense, but not the whole story. I slept better seeing the canvas largely blank, as I have had the experience now of the last 6 weeks of being on the other side of the veil, having the canvas filled in and seeing, in fact, the circumstances that we do face. This is probably the most dangerous period that I've lived through. This is the idea that right now we are witnessing the biggest military build-up since the end of the Second World War. That's a big thing to observe. That's a big thing to be happening. What's the conclusion to that? What have the conclusion to military build-ups of that kind been in the past? Have they ended with happy endings? That's what keeps me awake at night. And how do we, in the midst of that, maintain a system of democratic government when there are also a whole lot of, and it goes to the earlier answer, a whole lot of internal challenges to the way democracies operate in an era where, as I say, there isn't an objective truth, and that makes things pretty challenging. And so I do actually have a sense of optimism that we will kind of come to terms with some new normals here around the way democracies operate, but also, I hope getting to a place of global balance and security. But navigating that path, and that path is being navigated right now. You know, like this is not something decades down the track. It's right now. You know, that it is not obvious, not clear, and difficult. And you know, that is the challenge that we face as a country. That is the challenge that I think as a partnership and alliance that we need to pull off.
Well, we have time for one more. Okay.
Tom, we got time.
Hi, Doug Stewart from the National Bureau of Asian Research. Thank you for your time today. You've been talking about the China military buildup as a serious challenge. I was wondering how you balance this with other China security challenges around like economic coercion, influence ops. You mentioned the misinformation. So how do you balance these with the ongoing military challenges?
Well, firstly, in terms of you know, disinformation has many sources, so I don't want it to be seen that I was making that observation. But I think it is right that China engages the world in a whole of state way. Yes, it is a massive military build-up, but you're right, it's not just that. There's a weight to the Chinese economy, and the nature of it being state-run, I mean state-directed, which means they do statecraft in a very particular way, and I think it's, you know, we've got to think it all through and think about what impact that's having on the world and where our interest lies, and it is complicated. You know, like it's China's our biggest trading partner. Like I mean, in that sense, we're invested in China. As is the United States, and you know, as is Japan. So that's why this is a really complex question. There's an upside, of course, to that. I mean, when we think about global risk, and I know that there's a kind of a you know, Russia's economy. There was a significant degree of economic interaction between Russia and Europe. So none of these things are a guarantee. But I do think that the economic interaction between China and the rest of the world is ultimately a plus, and is helpful in the sense of finding a pathway to some kind of strategic balance. But I think I think a lot of this through the lens of the Pacific, which is probably the area where I know best, and yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of measures which have nothing to do with the projection of Chinese defence power, where they've had an enormous influence over countries in the Pacific, and indebtedness immediately comes to mind. And you know, we've got to be thinking about that. I do think. We do development pretty well, but I think we have the potential, I know I'm talking about Australia and America, I think we have the potential to do development a whole lot better, like I really do. And I think doing that and in a sense presenting that alternative is the way we need to be engaging, if I can put it that way.
Deputy Prime Minister, I want to thank you for that, for answering a series of questions. I think I can perhaps summarise your answers by saying that we're in a dangerous era to be approached pragmatically, but also with optimism. Thank you for opening the ASPI office. Thank you for everyone for joining. We have some food and some drinks to allow a bit of mingling. If you have time to stay, you're all welcome. But Deputy PM, it's been an absolute pleasure. We are filled with pride that you were able to be here to open the office. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Justin. And they have all disappeared.